Um, we are being recorded, but not the Q&A, just when David speaks. So I don't need to get your permission for that. Only David's permission, and you've given it.
Yeah.
So, well, my name is Mary Davis. I'm the Secretary of the Library. Welcome to this lecture, which is online and in person, and using the wonderful hybrid technology that Marks Memorial Library has now got, and we hope that it works well. On here. This lecture is a joint one between Emma for cultural relations in Russian and Soviet studies. And Ralph Gibson here will say a little bit about the SCRSS in a moment. On behalf of Marks Memorial Library, we encourage you not just to come to lectures, but also to join the library. And there are forms on your seats to join this very wonderful place. If you're not already a member, please do join. The benefit, for example, you will get a copy of our theoretical journal, Theory and Struggle, for free online. That is, you can pay for the, you get it for free online. You can use our library, of course, and it's remarkable. You can come to these meetings and our courses and classes. We're very, very pleased to welcome today Professor David Lane. This is the centenary, so in other words, the anniversary of the foundation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And David is going to be speaking precisely on that, 100 years since the foundation. I want to introduce David, but before I do, I would just invite Ralph to say a little bit about the organisation that we're.
The Society for Cooperation in Russian Soviet Studies, we're celebrating our centenary in 2 years' time. We have an archive and building in Brixton, which you're all welcome to visit, dedicated to the Soviet era, and that's the primary purpose of our collections. So if anybody's interested in knowing more about the Society, do have a chat with me before you leave. I can give you the website details and so on. But yeah, we're delighted to be co-hosting the event tonight. We've been doing, I think, since the 2017, we've been doing an annual October-November event, and I think it'd be fascinating to hear what Dr. Lane. Thank you.
Just to say that next year is the 90th anniversary of Marks Memorial Library, so there'll be special events for that. So watch out for them. David Lane is a fellow of the Royal Academy, of the Academy of Social Sciences, and Emeritus Fellow of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. He's a visiting professor at Beijing University, and as I said before, Vice President of the SCRSS. I extensively on socialism, post-socialism, capitalism, industrial societies. His recent publications include The Changing Regional Alliances for China and the West with Zhu, The Eurasian Project in Global Perspective, The Capitalist Transformation of State Socialism, with a revised Russian edition, and his current work, Capitalism and Its Rivals, will be published in 2023, but he's written an awful lot more than that. That's just a little snapshot. So David is going to discuss the trajectory of the development of the socialist state in 3 periods. It's very, very important, I think, that we're considering federalism and what it means, given what it doesn't mean today. I'm sure you know what I mean in relation. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to David. When he's finished speaking, we will cease recording, and there'll be an opportunity for questions, answers, and discussion, including those who I can't see who are online. So David, we're very pleased you're here and look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to this quite interesting place and interesting people, I hope. The United States and the Soviet Union both claim uniqueness in 20th century world history. Each projected for itself a global civilizational role for capitalism and socialism, respectively. Both consider themselves to be civilizations with an inherent economic, political, and moral superiority, models worthy of replication outside their geographical areas. The Soviet state had two major claims to exceptionalism. First, as a post-colonial, federative, multinational socialist state. And second, as a planned socialist economy, directed by a party-state apparatus. The state existed to build socialism. One important difference from the United States is that the myth of American capitalist exceptionalism continues, whereas the exceptionalism of Soviet socialism remains an historical episode. So my lecture addresses how the USSR was formed, in what respects it succeeded, and how, in the period between 1986 and 1991, it was dismantled. Whatever its faults, the Soviet Union provided an alternative to Western market capitalism. But the Soviet model had its own internal contradictions, and confrontation with the West shaped the contours of internal Soviet policy. Three major political and economic configurations have defined the state system of the USSR. A federative political system, a single-party hegemonic state, and state-led economic and social development. The first claimed that a federative state could be formed on the basis of fraternal relations between different geographically clustered nationalities. The second, that a socialist state should be predicated on a single political hegemonic socialist political party. And third, that a modern post-capitalist industrial system could be constructed on the basis of a state economic plan, independently of an economic market and private property. The USSR was exceptional in yet another but perverse way. All three of its distinguishing features were disavowed by the Soviet leadership between 1985 and 1991. And the dismantling of the USSR through declarations of sovereign independence by its constituent republics precipitated the collapse, not only of the Soviet state, but with the wider social, Soviet, and economic political order. The Soviet Union was born out of the political formation of Tsarist Russia. Unlike empires of Western European countries such as Great Britain, the Tsarist Empire was one continuous landmass. It was a multinational constituted of Russians, 44% of the population, followed by Ukrainians, 18%, Poles, 6.5%, and Jews in that order, and a large number of other nationalities. Although these peoples were settled in geographically distinct areas, a considerable significance has to be given to the political and economic power of Russians who were spread throughout the whole country. In the European areas of the country, there were no geographical boundaries marking countries of the empire. The empire was divided into provinces, which were governed by laws related to the socialist state of the residents. That is to say, there were laws affecting peasants, townsmen, and the aristocracy, as well as ethnic groups such as the Jews. So the rights of the estates to the ownership of property and geographical movement were differentiated. but it was regarded in terms of the state structure. In the late 19th century, the political objective of the socialist revolutionary movement was to abolish the privileges associated with the states and to set up a democratic state, to move initially to a bourgeois democratic republic and then at some later time to a socialist one. The socialist movement considered social class rather than nationality or ethnic condition to be the major and decisive form of social division and political action. So from the socialist point of view, classes were the important factors. Classes, however, in the Tsarist Empire were conjoined with national and ethnic groups. Political to the opposition to the autocracy took not only a class character, but also nationalist forms. The Russian Marxist position distinguished between the political strategy to be adopted in the course of the bourgeois democratic revolution, that is, the country arising from a pre-capitalist political order, such as Tsarism at the time, and the transition from a capitalist economy to the socialist formation. In the former, national self-determination was a positive strategy and should be supported. In colonial countries, foreign imperial domination was worse than national capitalism. So here, oppressed nationalities would be justified in seeking independence from the oppressing classes, even if such independence led to a national form of capitalism. Whereas, in the transition from a capitalist society to socialism, oppressed classes could only be liberated if they opposed the domination of nationalists who favored capitalism. So the logic of this theoretical position worked out before 1917, before the Bolsheviks came to power, entailed that nations subjected to any form of autocratic domination had the right to independence. A nationalist movement could be progressive if it sought independence from colonial domination. So, oppressed nations like the Tatars in Tsarist Russia were to be supported in their liberation claims. Liberation had a democratic content, even if nationalist objectives were capitalist. However, oppressor nations seeking independence, that would be Russians in Tsarist Russia, on the other hand, had to be opposed. There was no democratic or socialist content. They were simply nationalists. Lenin was particularly aware of the domination of Great Russians, who were an oppressor nation in the Tsarist Empire, and he emphasized that Great Russians' power had to be opposed. Lenin recognized that national minorities had a real grievance against oppressor colonial nations, of which Russia was one. Then were the general suppositions which informed the socialist movement in Russia in the early 20th century. After the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks in October 1917, the national question presented practical problems of state formation. The problem confronting the political movements was whether the Russian Empire could be reconstituted in another political socialist form, or whether it should and could be broken up into separate national republics. How would a state system be organized under a communist regime? Should it continue as a unitary socialist state, or as a federative republic based on national populations? The Bolsheviks inherited the Tsarist Empire as it had been shaped by the provisional government, which had been set up in February 1917, following the collapse of the Tsarist rule. The provisional government had maintained the boundaries of the former Russian Empire as far as they could. However, autonomous regional governments had formed under the provisional government, and they were not initially declared themselves as independent states and continued under the jurisdiction of the provisional government. So they declared their independence as states, but they nevertheless continued under the provisional government, the Russian government. In 1917, the country fell apart. System of dual power. Both the Soviets and other claimants to power declared their regional political autonomy. So as new incumbents of political power, the Bolshevik leaders were confronted by the dilemma of how such groups and areas could be assimilated into the Socialist Republic. Lenin's early thinking was in line with the general assumptions of the socialist movement in Russia, which favored a form of independence within a unitary state. They would continue, in other words, in the similar form as under the Tsarist Empire. Before the October Revolution, federalist forms were not favored by the socialist movement because it was thought that economically they would hinder the development of the productive forces, that's the development of capitalism, and politically they would blur the development of working class consciousness. A federal system, that was argued, would weaken the working class as a basis for a socialist state. So rather paradoxically, you may think, they were in favor of a unitary system, similar to what the Tsarist Russia represented. Following the capture of power by the Bolsheviks in October 1917, Lenin's position changed. Nationalists as well as bourgeois democratic forces challenged the Bolshevik government. Russia as a state disintegrated as civil war broke out. In December 1917, nationalist parties in Lithuania and Finland claimed independence, followed by Latvia and Estonia in February 1918. During the civil war between the Bolsheviks and white forces, Soviet power was also confronted by nationalist opponents. They challenged both the Russian state order and its Bolshevik form in terms of the Soviets. In several areas, including Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, nationalist parties declared their countries' independence from the Russian Soviet Republic, which Lenin represented. That wasn't all. Also, Bolshevik Soviets declared their own regional sovereignty, though within the framework of the Russian Soviet state. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly on 19th of January 1918 led to the declaration by the Third Congress of Soviets that Russia constitutionally was a republic of the workers, of the Soviets of workers, soldiers, and peasants' deputies. The Soviet Russian Republic was established on the basis, and here I quote, of the free union of free nations as a federation of Soviet national republics. It was a Rossiyskaya Respublika, that's an all-Russian republic, rather than just an ethnic Russkaya republic, and was made up of national Soviet republics. January 1918, for instance, in Kharkov, the communists founded a separate Donetsk Voivodsk Soviet Republic, comprising the former gubernias of Donbass, Kharkov, Yekaterinburg, and Kherson. History is repeating itself. While asserting their autonomy, they retained their place in the Russian Soviet Federation. In the conclusion of the Civil War, 4 self-declared socialist republics remained independent sovereign states. The Bolshevik policy to relate to that. Bolshevik policy was to form an all-Russian federative Soviet republic. In his report to the 10th All-Russian Congress of Soviets on 26th of December 1922, Joseph Stalin put forward 3 reasons, and here I quote, that impel the republics to take the path of political union. First, economically, Combining the resources of the republics was rational, as the uneven division of labor between the republics made the, quote, full development of individual regions impossible. Transport required a single plan. Foreign credit was also denied to the new Soviet states. Secondly, Stalin said, the international situation presents a foreign economic boycott and diplomatic isolation. The international military threat requires, quote, a single and continuous military front. Third, Stalin contended that the class nature of the Soviet regime calls for union, in the sense that there was a natural harmony between the emerging class position of the peoples of the Soviet republics. The nationalities in the Soviet states, he considered, were drawing together, given the basis for unity in one, quote, single independent state. Within the Soviet socialist state, nations would enjoy regional autonomy. Stalin anticipated that new socialist nations would develop under Soviet rule. The independent socialist republics, on the basis of bilateral treaties, then approved the formation of the Union of Socialist Republics on the 30th of December 1922. 4 republics, the largest being the Russian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, second, the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic, and the Ukrainian and the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republics then constituted the USSR. The Russian and Transcaucasian republics were themselves federative states encompassing nationally based autonomous regions. So the different nationalities in these areas had their own little mini republics within those republics. In the Russian Federation, Russian was the official language, and in all the other republics, Russian jointly with the language of the titular republic. The declaration made it clear that the union was based on the, quote, the principle of voluntary consent and equal rights of the republics, each of which has the right freely to secede from the union of republics. What was the Marxist rationale for the formation of a federative republic? In acknowledging the rise of nationalism, the Communist Party's strategy was to utilize nationalism to support the socialist revolution and to maintain the Bolsheviks in power. The objective was to preserve the geographical boundaries of the Tsarist state. Lenin's proposal was to accept the cultural aspects of nationalism while disarming politically the nationalist movements. The Soviet leadership devised a federative system which recognized and incorporated geographically clustered nationalist groups into the Soviet state, not as in Tsarist Russia, as a component in a unitary state, but as a constitutional entity in a federative republic. Lenin perceived, correctly in my view, that support from the nationalist movements was essential for the preservation of the gains of the October Revolution. Soviet Marxists considered that nationalism was a bourgeois ideology. It would wither away with the maturation of socialist society. The working class, being politically hegemonic in the socialist revolution, would condition the political expression of nationalism. Federative structure was not intended to give political sovereignty to the constituent republics. The nationalists had to be neutralized, not defeated, and co-opted to the Soviet side to preserve the socialist revolution. Lenin's federative policy, even within the socialist movement, was subject to considerable criticism. The alternative was to maintain a unitary socialist state, for the reasons I've already mentioned, as far as possible, to maintain that state within the borders of the former Russian imperial empire. Rosa Luxemburg, for example, condemned the policy and contended that nationalist movements were anachronistic. The recognition of national interest and their incorporation as republics into a federal state structure, she claimed, made no economic or political sense in terms of Marxist logic of development. In 1918, she contended that the Bolshevik slogan of the right of self-determination of peoples, had led to the disintegration of Russia. The tactics should be to establish, she said, the foundations of a socialist society, not self-determination, which is nothing but a hollow, petty bourgeois phraseology and humbug. There were, I think, two weaknesses in Luxemburg's argument. Firstly, she did not recognize the significance of oppression experienced by national groups in colonial countries. Such subjection and its political implications were recognized both by Lenin and by Stalin. Secondly, Luxemburg, talking in 1917, did not anticipate the enormous task facing the Soviet leadership to achieve power after 1917, and the immense struggle necessary to defeat their opponents, both domestic nationalists and foreign states. Given the economic and political situation in Russia during the Civil War, compromise with the nationalists was necessary for the Soviet state to survive. Moreover, the Bolshevik government lacked support among the peasantry, which formed the social base of the nationalists. Here it is important to recognize that social class, in complicated ways, overlapped with the national identity, which has proved to be a long-lasting problem for the Soviet state. For the Bolshevik leadership, the national question was predicated on the fact that the proletariat of the Russian Empire was located in the urban industrialized areas and was Russian in terms of language and culture, whereas in the non-Russian ethnic areas, the intelligentsia, supported by the rural peasantry, was nationalist in culture and bourgeois in terms of politics. The division of labor overlapped with the national composition of the population. So what appeared as a national question was rooted not only in language, history, and culture, but also in the nature of the economic division of labor and the class structure. The effects of the economic division were experienced not only as class, but consequence on political and economic domination by ethnic Russians, also as national antagonisms. So the assumptions of the Soviet leadership at the time were that with national development under its political hegemony, a socialist culture would come to prevail. Nationalist culture, predicated on language and history, would remain, but would be contained and shaped in a socialist political and ideological environment. So, an individualistic cultural nationalism could thrive in a Soviet republic, but the articulation of a collective national consciousness would not be allowed. The Soviet federative state would be national in form and socialist in content. Rather than shifting nationalist aspirations, the nationalists would have regional autonomy, respecting national cultures and languages, but the economic, ideological, and political content would be socialist. A policy of industrialization would lead not only to the social development of the Russian Empire, but concurrently to the formation of an industrial working class, which in itself would become the political basis of the Soviet regime. Then you might say, would the Bolshevik government retain political power in a federative state? Would the nationally based republics undermine the all-Russian socialist government? And this was a concern of critics such as Luxemburg. So the USSR was a paradoxical state formation. Formally, it was a federative system constitutionally composed of sovereign states legitimated by treaties. Like other federations in Western states, its legislature was bicameral, with a Soviet of nationalities composed of an equal number of deputies from each of the constituent republics. The Constitution gave the right of secession to the republics. The republics had residual powers granted under the Constitution of the USSR. Each had its own constitution and Communist Party, except for the Russian Federation, which was part of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The language of the titular republics was recognized, in addition to Russian, as the official language. Each republic had its own national symbols, flag, badge, and again, with the exception of Russian Federation, its own national anthem. However, the formal legislative political structure of republics, so the Republic Soviets, was symbolic, not the source of legislation. The all-union central administration in Moscow had effective control of the republic's economy and budget. Well, you might say, how did they do that? To ensure the cohesion of the federative system, two institutions were established. These were the state ministries of the USSR and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Power rested with the government ministries and the central apparatus of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The state administration of the Union under Gosplan devised a centralized plan which decided priorities, the allocation of investment and finance for the USSR as a whole, and detailed budgets for the republics. The second distinctive feature of the Soviet state was constituted by the hegemony of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In the communist federative state, the centralization of the economic administration came under the direction of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and enabled the Union government to predominate over the republics. Nationalities were respected, and a form of positive discrimination in favor of non-Russian nationalities was encouraged by the policy of Korenization. This entailed the promotion of people from the eponymous nationalities to leading positions in the republics. These two interrelated but separate institutions provided economic and political coherence and unity to the Soviet federative state. Communist Party of the Soviet Union supplied the political leadership, articulated political policy, and exercised political control. Both governments and the party organizations were organized on a hierarchical principle. Lower organs were subordinate to higher ones. Management and the placement of personnel were also performed by the nomenclatura system, which was under the guidance of the Communist Party. From 1923, the political institutions of the USSR, led by the CPSU, regulated the federative system, and the state institutions enforced an all-union policy. The union state apparatuses had control of the armed forces, the police, and security. In practice, the all-union forms of administration ensured a unitary and centralized state. In other words, the Union controlled the economic, ideological, and coercive institutions of the Soviet state. The USSR enjoyed the economic and defense benefits of a unitary state and the political legitimacy of a federation. The negative side of the Soviet state was the suppression of opponents of the regime by the all-union security apparatuses. Opposition to Soviet power was offered by nationalist groups well after the consolidation of Bolshevik power, and the centralized power ministries exercised severe and uncontrolled repression against suspected opponents of the Soviet regime. The security forces operated independently of political and legal controls and were responsible for unjustifiable deportations and executions. The exercise of power was a consequence, in my view, of the Tsarist heritage of oppression, domestic opposition to Soviet power, the threat to security posed by foreign powers, and the lack of a political culture of control of the security services. The positive side was the comprehensive economic and social development. One of the objectives of Soviet policy was to ensure comprehensive industrial development over the whole of the USSR, and this would form a working class and ensure a socialist political base in the republics. All republics experienced a significant rise in industrial development. To get ready for the slide. While there were considerable positive developments, significant differences remained between republics. Using 1922 as a base year, by 1940, industrial output in various republics were as follows. 1922 as a base, 1940 industrial output was 46 times greater in the Tajik Republic, 28 times greater in Kazakhstan, 26 times greater in the Russian Federation, 19 times greater in Ukraine. And if you look at the figure which I put on the board there, this quantifies the growth of the total industrial output of the republics of the USSR from 1922 to 1940 to 1970 and 1980. Compared to 1922, there was considerable disparity in growth rates between the republics. The Russian Federation, for example, had increased 267 times production by 1970 and 465 times by 1980. So here you can see the very great industrialization process which had taken place. At the end of the other end of the scale, Azerbaijan had increases of only 59 times and 129 times. However, these are still really quite high rates of industrial development. What these figures show is not only rapid industrial growth, but diversified geographical industrial development, but also the formation of a Soviet working class in all the republics, which was intended to provide the political gravitas for Soviet power in the republics. Well, I've got some data on that, but I haven't got time to show it. To the welfare of the population, average wage income provides a guide to how living conditions were developing across the republics. In the next graph, get it ready, shows the average income of manual and non-manual workers by republics for 3 years, in 1940, 1960, and 1980. The average money income for manual and non-manual workers is arranged in descending order by republics from left to right. Corresponding incomes for each republic for 1960 and 1980 are shown on the lines above. So the graph shows an all-round increase, but the differentials between republics did not significantly decline. As we see from the chart, the differentials increased for Turkmenistan, Russian Federation, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Kazakhstan. Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Belarus, and Moldavia had a below average increase. By 1980, the income distribution was much more uneven and the range between the republics was much higher. For example, in 1980, the average wage in the Russian Federation was 178 rubles, and in Ukraine, it was 23 rubles lower, that is 155 rubles. Over here you can see the growth in money income and also the differences between the republics. So there was a very considerable increase, a general all-round increase in all the republics, but some of them did better than the others. So we might conclude that the centralization of economic and political control led to significant positive economic and social development in all the republics. The Soviet Union had astonished Western commentators by the speed of industrialization, which is shown in my first chart, the quality of its military armaments, and the comprehensive provision of health and educational services. It could rightly claim to be the first successful planned socialist economy. By the 1970s, the Soviet state had become a major world power, and nuclear armaments and advanced industries, and significant achievements in culture and also in sport. The republics had shared in this development, but in different ways, and some at a faster pace than others. Politically, in line with the Marxist-Leninist way of thinking, a political base in the form of an industrial working class had been built in all the republics of the USSR. The euphoria about the success of the Soviet Union faded from the 1970s. The economy had experienced declining rates of growth. The Soviet political leadership conceded that the economy was stagnant. Geopolitically, the Soviet Union had lost at considerable cost the war in Afghanistan, which had been backed by the West. It was confronted by a hostile West, led by President Bush and Margaret Thatcher. The American Star Wars program increased the need for defense expenditure. Internally, expectations for a higher standard of living to fulfill earlier promises by the Soviet leaders, and the expectations for a more participative and modern type of economy required a response from the political leadership. Challenges that I mentioned were no greater than those which had in previous decades confronted the Soviet Union. Neither in the USSR nor in the Eastern European states was there any imminent threat of destabilization. The dissident movement, with the exception of Solidarity in Poland, was weak and unorganized. The repressive forces of the Stalinist period had been renounced following the leadership of Khrushchev. Nationalist movements had been contained in the shell of the federative state and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which I've already mentioned. However, there were strong movements for economic reform in the East European socialist countries, and Eurocommunism in Western Europe, particularly in the UK, provided a critique of the hierarchical party-led system. Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985. Reform of the economy was expected. His proposals, moreover, exceeded the expectations not only of Western leaders, but also of the reform movements in the communist states. On the 25th of February 1986, Gorbachev introduced a new version of the program of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. In his speech, he outlined what he and other reformers considered to be fundamental problems of the Soviet state, and his proposals for perestroika were the ways to solve them. And I quote his speech: "The forms of production relations, the system of running and managing the economy have become obsolete. They have lost their role as incentives, and here and there they have turned into impediments." Gorbachev then went on to describe negative features of the Soviet regime and the inadequacies of the centralized bureaucratic system. The program Perestroika would transform the USSR to a modern, pluralistic, and democratic state, acceptable as an equal by the Western states. Gorbachev had a vision of the future. The program of the Soviet Union was to provide a beacon for progressive forces predicated on human rights, a pluralist society, a market-led economy, and a return to European civilization values. The political objectives of Gorbachev were to put in place the legitimacy of markets and democratic competition, the conditions for a move to private property, and most important of all, a political settlement with the West. The Soviet federative state system would remain, as would the fundamental class features of state socialism. The processes would take a more pluralistic form, governed by law. Democratization meant a more pluralist system in which the Communist Party would lose its monopoly of political power in the context of more open elections. The introduction of market relations and private ownership of productive assets would severely curtail the Soviet system of central planning. Glasnost would allow public criticism of the regime. In international relations, he proposed a more devolved policy towards the European countries of the Soviet bloc. And most important of all, a move towards détente with the USA and NATO. It was a humanistic version of socialism. This party would have to govern on different terms and in a pluralist framework. Acceptance by the West, however, entailed meeting the conditions demanded by the Western powers, particularly the United States. As the reform movement gathered pace, the institutions of planning and political control were consciously dismantled by the reform leadership. Articles 3 and 6 of the Constitution of the USSR were struck out. The principle of democratic centralism no longer guided the Soviet states, and the CPSU was no longer, quote, the leading and guiding force of Soviet society and the nucleus of its political system of all state and public organizations. This was taken from the earlier constitutions, which of course gave the Communist Party really the central form of power and the legitimacy of power, which was embodied in the Soviet constitution. Three major coordinating and hegemonic institutions of the Soviet order were dismantled. The central system of state planning, the apparatus of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and with it the nomenclatura system of appointments. In sum, these developments constituted the preconditions for the breakup of the USSR. And here we return to the federative structure, which I started at the beginning of my talk. Republics were the instruments which dismantled the state form of the USSR. Secession from the Union was declared first on the 11th of March 1990 by the Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic. This preempted the referendum on the renewal of the USSR, called by the government of the USSR on the 17th of March 1991. In the referendum, with the exception of Baltic republics, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, which had boycotted the referendum, 78% of those voting endorsed, and here I will quote, the preservation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics in which the rights and freedoms of a person of any nationality will be fully guaranteed. The results of this referendum were ignored by the heads of the republics. Republican leaders were set out to break the USSR. On the 12th of December 1991, by the 12th of September 1991, all the republics of the USSR had declared their own independence. On the 8th of December 1991, at the Belovezh Accord, was signed by the heads of the state of Russia, that's Yeltsin, Ukraine, and Belarus. It recognized each other's independence and declared the formation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. On the 25th of December, Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. On the 26th of December, the Supreme Soviet of the USSR dissolved itself. On the 31st of December 1991, the USSR ceased to exist. That comes to the end of our story. The assets of the USSR were taken over by the 15 republics which had previously formed the USSR. The end of the USSR as a state formation also terminated the era of state socialism. Gorbachev's own evaluation of perestroika period was positive. In his resignation statement, he praised the liquidation of the totalitarian system, the breakthrough on the path of democratic transformation, which had led to greater freedom, the multi-party system, and the movement towards a multi-layered economy with equality of all forms of property, as his words, and an end had been put to the Cold War. The USSR had lost the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact and the economic formation of Comecon were dissolved. The Russian the Federation became the successor state of the USSR. These were not national revolutions, but capitalist counter-revolutions in a nationalist shell. With the destruction of the party state of the USSR, the superstructure of the communist system was replaced by institutions hurriedly imported from the West. What then were the underlying features which led to the downfall not only of the Soviet state, but also of the social system of state socialism? Of the independent movements were factions of the incumbent political elites in the republics. The union-level referendum showed that a substantial majority of the population was in favor of renewing the USSR. Recognize, however, that there was also in many areas a significant minority in favor of the republics securing independence, and the republics later received their own mandates for secession. In other words, all the countries, in some way or other, mainly through their elected governments, the Soviets, passed resolutions for independence by quite large majorities usually. Clearly, there remained strong nationalist movements in the Baltic states and the Caucasus. There were also widely shared criticisms, particularly by the rising middle classes, of the economic and political processes of the Soviet state. The creation of a national political consciousness, however, was a consequence of the elites in the republics reviving nationality as a basis for their own legitimacy. The politicization of peoples on the basis of nationality had developed rapidly after 1988, but national forms of opposition which developed in the republics against the center were a consequence, not a cause, of the perestroika policies of Gorbachev. Under Gorbachev, the Central Powers relaxed their control. The executives of the all-union political and economic institutions formed the core of the Soviet Union's political class, those in control of the national economy and political policy. The elites in the republics were in an ambiguous position. The discrediting of the USSR institutions and the legitimating ideology created conditions in which the Republican elites had potentially more to gain than to lose by the assertion of Republican independence, concurrent with a move to the market. The policy of Korenizatsiya had secured significant representation of the eponymous nationalities in elite positions in the republics. As a consequence of the weakening of the all-union Soviet political class, control and in future ownership of economic assets and political power would shift to the Republican and regional elites. However, it's important not to conflate the reform movement into a nationalist movement. The former legitimated the latter. In the East European countries, for example, ethnically homogeneous societies, the DDR, Poland, Hungary, for example, developed their own reform movements independently of any national movements, and they took a very similar course to that in Russia. Also, the assertion of the rights in the Russian Federation, led by Yeltsin, did not have any significant national ethnic base. It had a political objective, articulating the interests of the ascendant capitalist class. Role of class interest is often occluded by the emphasis put on national and ethnic identity. In the Union republics of the USSR, a national identity was revived or created and legitimated the dismantling of socialist institutions. Nationalism was a convenient form of legitimation for the radical reform movements. It had crucial social and political legitimating functions. The economic and political content of the reform program was as much derived from class interest as from national identity. A national identity could have been preserved in a socialist commonwealth of independent states, for instance. That is, the economy of the USSR in a different but socialist shell. The dissolution of the USSR was articulated by chinovniks turned capitalists, that is to say, government functionaries turned capitalists. Dismantling the USSR gave rights over the property and functions of the all-union ministries to the republics. Let me then just sum up in 1 or 2 minutes the main points that I've made in this talk. The federative political formation successfully promoted the economic and social development of the peoples of the USSR. Centralized economic planning was a success. The Communist Party control of the all-union state administration provided unity to the federative economic and political system. The institutions worked well in the formative stages of the USSR. However, the centralized economic and political system by the end of the 1970s was becoming a brake on the economic, political, and cultural development of the peoples of the USSR. Reform of the political and economic system was needed. The reform process under Gorbachev was hasty, poorly devised, and badly handled by the USSR political leadership, counseled by the West. Policies led not to the renewal of the USSR in a more advanced, pluralistic, and better planned form. but they effectively dismantled the Soviet political and economic system. The federative system, through the process of korenizatsiya, had led to the formation of elites which were predisposed to secession from the state formation of the USSR. Following the dismantling of the federative state, which formed the Soviet economic and political structures, the new independent states followed a path to market capitalism. The Republican political and economic elites were also able to promote their ideal and material interests through a move to markets and private property. This suggests that class interests were intertwined with the nationalist movements. Whereas the USSR was a federative republic, national in form and socialist in content, the transformation led by the reform movement resulted in independent states which were national in form and capitalist in content. The fault lines for ending state socialism have to be sought not in the nature of the federative or unitary state, but in class interests, which were suppressed in the USSR, but liberated by the elites of the republics. The USSR's claim to exceptionalism, in the sense that it could build socialism without any threat of capitalism, has been falsified. And this has delivered a serious blow to the socialist movement and also to the realization of the socialist ideal.
Thank you very much. Well, we open it now.